thought that night would be like any other. I had folded the laundry, smoothed the quilt on my bed, and set a book down on the nightstand, ready to escape into words that made me feel less alone. My bedroom had always been the one place in the house that felt entirely mine. Safe, private, untouched by the noise of family judgment or whispered criticism. Tell me where you're watching from. This is just the start of our story. But safety, I would learn, was only an illusion. When I shifted a lamp to dust beneath it, I noticed the faintest glint, a reflection where no reflection should have been. At first, I thought I was tired imagining things, but the closer I leaned, the clearer it became. A tiny lens, cold, watching. My room wasn't my own anymore. My trust wasn't my own anymore. And in that moment, everything I believed about my home, about the people I lived with, cracked open in silence. So let's get into what happened after that night I saw the lens. My chest was pounding as I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at that little black circle no bigger than a button. I didn't touch it right away. I just sat there, my mind running in circles, trying to decide if I was losing my mind or if someone had truly invaded my life in the most private way possible. The lamp's light hit the lens again, making it impossible to deny. My skin prickled as I realized how many times I had walked around this room believing I was alone. Suddenly, every ordinary action of the past weeks replayed in my head. Every phone call I made sitting at my desk. Every time I changed clothes. Every tear I allowed to fall when no one was watching. Except someone had been. I wanted to scream, but I didn't. Instead, I forced myself to breathe slowly. My instinct was to yank it out of the wall, smash it, end it right then and there. But something deeper told me not to. Evidence, that was the word that came to me. If I destroyed it, I'd have nothing but my word against whoever had planted it. I walked out of my room and paced the hallway. My hands were trembling, but I tried to think through the fog. Who would do this? Why here? Why me? I tried to imagine each possibility, but one thought returned again and again. This wasn't random. Someone close enough to me to enter my home without permission had placed it there. That made my stomach twist. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined a faceless figure reviewing tapes, smirking at what they had captured. I hated how powerless I felt, lying in bed, not knowing who was behind it. By morning, I knew I had to act carefully. I went online, searching quietly, deleting my history afterward like some criminal covering her tracks. I learned about hidden cameras, about how often people overlook them, and about how the law treated evidence like this. What struck me most was a line on one forum. Don't react right away. Document everything. That became my mantra. Document everything. The next day, I borrowed a neighbor's ladder under the excuse of changing a bulb. With my phone angled carefully, I zoomed in on the device tucked behind the vent near my dresser. It was so small, so easily missed. I snapped photo after photo. Then I took a slow video, narrating softly to myself, timestamp visible on the screen. My hands shook, but I kept going, repeating what I'd read. Chain of evidence matters. By the time I was done, I felt a little steadier. I hadn't removed it. Whoever had put it there would believe it still worked, still invisible. That gave me a strange kind of power. I had proof now, and they didn't know it. The hardest part was acting normal. I had to smile at the neighbors, nod through casual conversations, even when my skin crawled with suspicion. Every sound at night made me flinch. Every time I heard a floorboard creak or a car door shut, I wondered if it was the person who had planted that camera, checking on me. I thought about telling a friend, but then fear silenced me. What if I was wrong? What if they thought I was paranoid? Worse, what if word got back to the person behind this before I was ready? No, I had to wait. I had to build this case carefully, so I kept going. I started to check the rest of the house in secret. Under lampshades, inside the smoke detector, behind picture frames. Each search left me more shaken, more suspicious, but I found nothing else. Only that one in my room. That almost made it worse. It wasn't random. It was deliberate, targeted. Nights stretched long, but in those quiet hours, I began to plan. I searched legal aid sites, took notes on what counted as admissible, and even started writing in a hidden notebook. Every date, every detail, every odd sound I noticed. It made me feel less helpless, like I was building something solid out of my fear. Weeks passed before I even touched the camera. By then, I'd gathered so much documentation that my notebook felt heavier than it should. I finally decided to remove the device one afternoon, after making sure I had filmed it from every angle. My fingers barely brushed it free, and still my heart raced. Holding it in my hand was like holding proof of a betrayal I hadn't asked for but could no longer ignore. I didn't go straight to the police. Not yet. I wanted to be sure. I wanted to walk into that station with more than just a story of violation. I wanted to walk in with a trail no one could deny. Looking back, that was the start of my transformation. Fear had been the first reaction, but somewhere between the late-night research, the whispered video recordings, and the act of writing everything down, something changed. I wasn't just a victim anymore. I was preparing for something bigger. Preparing for the day I would stand in front of someone with authority and finally say, "Here, look, this happened to me, and I can prove it." When I finally had the camera in my hands, I thought the hardest part was over, but holding that little piece of plastic and wires only raised more questions. Who had put it there? What had they seen? And more importantly, how was I supposed to move forward without losing my nerve? I hid it in an old shoebox in the back of my closet, between piles of folded winter clothes. I checked the box 3 times that night, convinced it might somehow disappear. Each time, the same weight sat there, reminding me I was still living with a truth no one else knew. The next morning, I made myself act normal. I went to work, smiled politely when people asked about my weekend, and forced myself to drink coffee at the break room table as if my life hadn't been turned inside out. But inside, I kept replaying conversations. Had anyone dropped hints? Had I overlooked someone's offhand comment or joke that might have revealed too much? When I came home that evening, I walked through the front door slower than usual. Every creak of the floorboard seemed louder, every shadow stretched longer. I found myself scanning the corners of each room, even though I'd already checked. The house no longer felt like my house. It felt like a place I had to monitor. I sat down at my kitchen table and opened the notebook where I'd been documenting everything. That day I wrote, "Removed device. Evidence secured. Still unknown who placed it. Continue daily notes." It wasn't much, but writing it down gave me a fragile sense of control. As the days passed, I started to notice things I hadn't before. A neighbor who always seemed to linger when I pulled into the driveway. A relative who asked strangely specific questions about my evenings. The more I paid attention, the more suspicious I became of nearly everyone around me, and that paranoia, it wore me down. One night, I thought about calling the police right then and there. I even held my phone in my hand ready to dial, but I hesitated. What if they dismissed me? What if I was told it wasn't enough, or worse, that it couldn't be proven? The thought of being brushed aside, of standing in front of an officer only to be treated like I was exaggerating, froze me in place. Instead, I decided to learn more. Late at night, I scrolled through pages about privacy laws, court cases, and the way judges viewed hidden surveillance. The more I read, the clearer it became. If I wanted this to matter, I had to build a case too strong to ignore. That became my quiet mission. Each day I wrote in my notebook, adding small details, recording anything that felt out of place. If a car slowed down near my house, I wrote it down. If someone asked about my schedule, I noted it. The notebook grew heavier with each entry, and so did the weight in my chest. Still, there were moments when I doubted myself. I'd look at the device in the shoebox and wonder if I was blowing it out of proportion. Maybe it wasn't even recording. Maybe it was just some strange gadget dropped there by accident. But then I'd remember the cold reflection of that lens in the lamplight, the way it stared back at me. No, this wasn't a mistake. Weeks later, I decided to test myself. I invited a trusted coworker over. Someone I knew had no ties to my neighbors or relatives. Over dinner, I didn't tell her the full story, but I asked questions, small ones, about what she thought of hidden cameras and how courts viewed them. She didn't know the details, but She said something that stayed with me. If you've got proof, don't let anyone tell you it's not enough. Proof is proof. That night, after she left, I sat in the quiet living room and repeated her words to myself. Proof is proof. I had it. Now I just had to be strong enough to use it. The real test came not long after. I walked into my room one evening and noticed something subtle. The shoebox had shifted. My breath caught as I pulled it out. The camera was still there, but the lid of the box was slightly askew. Had I been careless, or had someone been inside when I wasn't home? I didn't sleep at all that night. I lay awake, listening for the smallest sound, my ears straining in the silence. For the first time, I realized just how vulnerable I was. Whoever did this wasn't just hiding behind a screen. They were close enough to touch the box where I'd hidden the evidence. The fear that night hardened into something else by morning. If I waited any longer, I risked losing everything. It was time to move past documenting and take the next step. I picked up my notebook, tucked the shoebox under my arm, and promised myself that soon I'd walk into a place where my voice couldn't be ignored. The morning after I noticed the shoebox had been moved, I knew I couldn't stall any longer. My fear had carried me as far as it could, but now it was pushing me toward action. If someone had come into my room again, they might already know I had discovered the camera. That thought alone forced me to grab the notebook, tuck it under my arm, and slide the shoebox into a larger bag. I drove into town with my heart pounding, gripping the steering wheel so tight my hands ached. I had decided on the police station. Even if they didn't take me seriously, at least I would have made a report. At least there would be a record. That mattered. When I walked inside, the lobby was almost empty. The officer at the desk glanced up, his expression somewhere between polite and tired. I told him I needed to report something serious, something about privacy, and he waved me toward a small office. That's where I sat across from another officer, explaining in halting words what I had found. He listened at first, but the longer I spoke, the more his eyebrows tightened. When I showed him the photos on my phone, he leaned back in his chair and sighed. "Look," he said, "I'm not saying it's nothing, but unless you can prove who put it there, it's not much of a case. Could have been planted years ago by a previous owner." I felt my stomach drop. I tried to explain that the box had been moved recently, that someone was still active in my house, but his tone was flat, dismissive. "Best I can do is write a report," he added. "You might want to think about changing your locks." I walked out of the station with the bag still heavy in my arms, feeling smaller than I had in weeks. I had done exactly what the guides told me, documented, preserved, reported, and still, I was treated like someone exaggerating a bad dream. That night, sitting at my kitchen table, I felt anger creep in. For weeks, I had been swallowing fear, playing it careful, doing everything right. And in one short conversation, it was brushed aside. I stared at the notebook in front of me, at the careful dates and times, and wondered if it would ever be enough. Still, I refused to let that be the end. I started looking for another way. Legal aid sites, community forums, even local news archives. I searched them all. It was on one of those late nights that I came across the name of a lawyer who had taken on cases involving privacy violations. She wasn't cheap, and I didn't know how I would afford her, but just knowing someone like her existed gave me a flicker of hope. Before I contacted her, I decided to confide in someone. Not about everything, but enough to test how my story sounded out loud. That person was Diane, a neighbor who had always been kind in small ways, bringing over soup when I was sick, helping carry groceries up the steps. Over coffee, I told her that I'd discovered something disturbing in my home, that I thought someone had been spying on me. Oh, her eyes widened, but she didn't laugh, didn't roll them. She asked careful questions. "Do you know who? Do you have proof?" When I told her I had the camera itself, she went quiet for a moment, then said, "If you've kept it safe, you need to use it. Don't let them make you feel like it doesn't matter." That moment of validation steadied me more than I expected. For the first time since I discovered the lens, someone else acknowledged the reality of it. Someone else believed me. With that courage, I called the lawyer's office. The receptionist told me to bring everything I had: photos, videos, the device itself. I scheduled the appointment for the following week, though the wait felt unbearable. Each night leading up to it, I double checked my locks, left lights on in every room, and kept the shoebox within reach. When the day finally came, I walked into the lawyer's office, clutching the bag like it was the only thing keeping me standing. She listened in a way the officer hadn't, leaning forward, nodding, interrupting only to ask for details. When I laid out the notebook, she read through page after page, tapping her pen lightly against the desk. "This is more than most people bring," she said. "It shows consistency. Dates, observations, evidence. You've done the hard part already." Her words nearly undid me. After weeks of doubt, someone finally said I wasn't overreacting. She explained that even without knowing exactly who planted it, the existence of the device itself was powerful. Combined with the timeline I'd built, it could carry weight in court. Walking out of her office, I felt something shift. For the first time, I wasn't just reacting. I was preparing to fight back. The meeting with the lawyer gave me momentum, but it also forced me to face the reality that this wasn't going to resolve quietly. Once she explained the process, I realized there would be hearings, paperwork, and eventually a courtroom where I would have to stand and speak. That thought made me uneasy, but it was better than sitting at home with nothing but questions. She told me the first step was filing a formal complaint. I spent hours going over the details of my notes, tightening the timeline, making sure there were no gaps. Every date had to be accurate, every observation written clearly. The act of reviewing it was painful. I relived the moment I saw the lens, the countless nights lying awake, the morning I discovered the shoebox had shifted. But I reminded myself that this wasn't just memory, it was evidence. When the complaint was filed, word traveled fast. I hadn't named anyone directly, but whispers spread through the neighborhood anyway. People began to look at me differently when I walked outside. Some with curiosity, some with doubt, and a few with thinly veiled judgment. I told myself not to care, but the shift was impossible to ignore. Then came the first real confrontation. A family member, someone I had never imagined being involved, came by one evening. He stood in my doorway with a forced smile, trying to make small talk. It felt rehearsed. After a few minutes, his tone changed. He said he'd heard some things and that maybe I was confusing myself with all the stress. He even suggested I drop it before it got out of hand. I froze, listening carefully to every word. He didn't admit anything, but the way he spoke made my stomach churn. It was less concern and more warning, as if he knew exactly what I was uncovering. I didn't argue. I simply nodded, walked him out, and locked the door behind him. Then I sat at the kitchen table, writing down every detail of the conversation. The next week, my lawyer requested that I bring the device in to be reviewed by a technician. They confirmed it was indeed a functioning camera. Worse, it had been active recently. The knowledge hit me hard. It meant my instincts had been right all along. This wasn't an old relic, this was ongoing. With that confirmation, the case moved forward. A hearing date was set, and I felt the clock ticking down each day. I practiced what I would say with my lawyer, going over the details again and again. She told me to stay calm, to focus on the facts, and not to let anyone twist the narrative into something else. But outside the office, things got more complicated. Diane pulled me aside one afternoon. She admitted she'd overheard two board members from the neighborhood talking about me, laughing about how I was making a scene over nothing. Hearing that made my blood run cold. It meant this wasn't just a hidden camera. It was connected to people I lived among, people who had keys, access, and authority. The days leading up to the hearing felt unreal. I kept the camera hidden in the shoebox, tucked into a locked cabinet. Each night I sat at my table rehearsing what I would say. I wasn't trying to be dramatic. I was trying to be steady, believable, undeniable. When the hearing finally arrived, I walked into the courthouse with the box under my arm and Diane by my side. My lawyer met me at the door, her calm presence a sharp contrast to the storm I carried inside. The room was smaller than I expected, less intimidating in size but heavy with the presence of people who didn't believe me. I sat quietly, as the other side tried to paint me as mistaken, even unstable. They said there was no proof anyone had planted anything, that I was exaggerating simple coincidences. My hands shook under the table, but when it was my turn, I placed the shoebox in front of the judge and carefully pulled out the device. The room fell silent. I explained how I had found it, how I had documented everything, how I had kept it intact until this moment. Then I opened my notebook and began reading the entries, one by one, each tied to dates and details. My voice wavered at first, but grew steadier the longer I spoke. By the time I finished, the air in the room felt different. The dismissive smiles were gone. Even those who had doubted me earlier leaned forward, realizing the weight of what I had shown. Leaving the courthouse that day, I didn't know how the final ruling would go, but I knew one thing clearly. I had finally shifted the burden. The evidence was no longer hidden in my closet or trapped inside my chest. It was out in the open, where it couldn't be denied. Walking out of the courthouse after that first hearing, I felt both lighter and heavier at the same time. Lighter because I had finally spoken the truth in front of people who mattered. Heavier because I knew it wasn't over. The device had been acknowledged, yes, but the fight had only just begun. My lawyer warned me that the other side would push back harder now. They'd try to discredit me, attack my character, and make the camera seem insignificant. "They'll want to turn this into a story about you, not about the evidence," she said. Her words stayed with me, and I prepared myself for it. Sure enough, within a week, rumors began to spread. A neighbor told me she'd overheard someone saying I was unstable, that I'd planted the camera myself just to make accusations. Hearing that made my stomach twist. It was one thing to be doubted quietly, but another to be openly accused of lying. Diane noticed the shift too. She came, by one afternoon with a worried look, telling me she'd overheard the same group of board members laughing about me again, louder this time, as if they wanted others to hear. "They're trying to paint you as the problem," she said softly. Her loyalty steadied me, but it also reminded me that this was bigger than just one hidden device. It was about power, about people trying to control the narrative. The second hearing was set 2 weeks later, and by then I had grown sharper in my resolve. I practiced with my lawyer, going through every possible question they might throw at me. I forced myself to look directly at the facts without flinching. The more I rehearsed, the less power the fear seemed to have. When the day came, the atmosphere in the courtroom was different. The opposition came in prepared, speaking confidently, even smugly. They suggested my evidence could have been tampered with, that the device might not even belong to them, and that I was simply seeking attention. My lawyer countered with the technician's report confirming the device was active. She reminded the judge that I had kept the chain of custody intact, that I had not tampered with it, and that the timestamps on my documentation aligned perfectly with the evidence. For a moment, the opposition faltered, their rehearsed calm cracking just slightly. Then they turned on me directly. They questioned my character, bringing up moments from years ago when I had argued with neighbors, as if those small disputes proved I was capable of inventing this. Sitting there, I felt heat rise in my face, but I forced myself to breathe. I had expected this. I reminded myself of my lawyer's warning. "They'll try to make this about you." When it was my turn to speak again, I didn't let my voice shake. I answered each question steadily, repeating the same truth I had carried since the night I saw the lens. I wasn't exaggerating. I hadn't planted anything. I had found the device, documented it, and kept it safe. That was the truth, and I stuck to it. The judge listened carefully, asking for clarifications, but never once dismissing me. That gave me strength. Even when the opposition tried to interrupt, the judge cut them off, reminding them that I had the right to speak. Leaving the courthouse that day, I realized something important. The doubt they tried to cast wasn't sticking as easily anymore. For the first time, it felt like the scales were beginning to shift. Back home, I sat at my kitchen table and opened my notebook again. I added every detail from the hearing, every question, every reaction I noticed. The notebook had grown thick by now, its pages filled with a story I never thought I'd be forced to write. But looking at it, I didn't feel powerless anymore. I felt ready. The days after that hearing were tense. I noticed unfamiliar cars parked near my street, idling longer than they should. I couldn't prove anything, but it added to the weight pressing down on me. Each time I wrote it down, refusing to let those moments pass unnoticed. Diane stayed close during this time. She brought over meals, sat with me in the evenings, and sometimes just listened while I vented. Having her around reminded me I wasn't entirely alone in this. Still, there were nights when I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering how far the other side would go to protect themselves. The next hearing loomed, and I knew it would be the most important yet. My lawyer explained that this was when the judge would decide whether the case would move forward formally. Everything hinged on the strength of what we had presented and how we held our ground against the attempts to smear me. The night before, I sat at my table, shoebox beside me, notebook open, and whispered to myself the words that had carried me through so far. Proof is proof. The third hearing carried a different weight than the others. By then, both sides had tested each other's patience and strategies, and I could feel that the judge was growing tired of the back and forth. My lawyer told me this was the stage where momentum mattered most. If we held firm, the other side's cracks would start to show. Walking into the courthouse that morning, I clutched my notebook tighter than ever. It had become more than paper and ink. It was my lifeline, the thing that grounded me whenever I felt myself drifting toward fear. The shoebox rested safely in my lawyer's bag, waiting to be pulled out once more if needed. The opposition began with their usual rhythm, dismissing the device as irrelevant and questioning my motives. They said again that I was inventing problems, trying to stir conflict for attention. But something was different this time. Their voices carried an edge, like they were straining to convince not just the judge, but themselves. My lawyer seized on that shift. She asked to submit the technician's written statement, verifying that the camera had been active and capable of recording. The judge accepted it without hesitation, and I watched the opposition falter. They hadn't expected the technical evidence to be so clear, so undeniable. When it was my turn, I spoke calmly, repeating the timeline I had lived through for months. I explained how I had discovered the lens, how I had documented it carefully, how I had resisted the urge to remove it until I had enough proof. I described the day I realized the shoebox had been moved, how that moment told me someone was still watching. My voice didn't shake this time. I had told the story so many times that it now came out steady, each detail anchored by the truth. Then came the moment that changed everything. Diane had been called to testify. She stepped forward nervously, but when she spoke, her words were clear. She told the judge about the conversations she had overheard between board members, how they had laughed at my expense, how they had mocked my discovery as making a scene. She said plainly that she believed I was being targeted. The courtroom grew quiet after she finished. For the first time, it wasn't just me against them. Someone else, someone respected in the neighborhood, had spoken up. That validation mattered. I could see it in the judge's expression, the way his posture shifted ever so slightly. The opposition scrambled. They tried to suggest Diane was mistaken, that she had misheard, but their tone carried less certainty now. Their polished confidence was starting to crumble. My lawyer pressed harder. She pointed out the consistency of my notes, the alignment with the technician's findings, and now the corroboration from a neighbor who had no reason to lie. Piece by piece, the picture became harder to dismiss. By the end of that hearing, the judge announced that the case would proceed to trial. The opposition's attempt to stop it had failed. As we walked out of the courthouse, my lawyer leaned toward me and whispered, "This is the turning point. They're on the defensive now." That night, I sat in my living room staring at the notebook. I thought about the months I had spent writing in it, the endless nights of doubt and fear, and how each page had led me here. I hadn't planned for this, hadn't asked for it, but somehow I had carried it this far. The days that followed were tense. I noticed less laughter from the people who used to mock me. Some avoided eye contact altogether. Others grew more defensive, snapping when I passed them on the street. It was as if they knew the tide had shifted, and they were scrambling to protect themselves. Diane continued to stand by me. One evening, she admitted she had struggled with whether to speak up at all, afraid of being dragged into the conflict. But she said she couldn't ignore what she had heard, not when she knew it could make the difference. I thanked her, knowing that without her testimony, the case might have stalled. As trial preparation began, I realized something unexpected. The fear that had once consumed me was giving way to something sturdier. I wasn't free of anxiety, not by any means, but I no longer felt like I was surviving day to day. I felt like I was building towards something, step by step, each detail adding to a story that could no longer be erased. The trial came faster than I expected. After months of hearings and preparation, the final day arrived with a weight I could feel in my chest from the moment I woke. My lawyer had warned me it would be draining, that I needed to conserve my focus for the moments that mattered most. Still, nothing could prepare me for walking into that courtroom, knowing it was the last chance to be heard. So let's get into what happened on that day. The air felt tense from the moment we entered. The opposition sat across the aisle, whispering to each other, their faces tighter than before. This wasn't the relaxed arrogance they had shown earlier. They knew what was at stake. The judge began promptly outlining the case and the evidence already presented. My lawyer spoke first, methodically reviewing every piece we had built together. The photos I'd taken, the video recordings, the technician's confirmation, the notebook filled with dates, and finally Diane's testimony. Each piece fit into the larger picture, a picture I had lived through in silence for too long. When it was the opposition's turn, they tried their old strategies, claiming I had overreacted, that I was seeking attention, that the device might have been placed there long ago by someone unrelated. But the judge cut through their arguments with questions they couldn't answer. Why had the device been active recently? Why had multiple witnesses confirmed suspicious conversations? Why had I been able to document a consistent chain of evidence when, by their account, none of this mattered? Then came the moment I had both dreaded and anticipated. I was called to the stand again. My legs felt heavy as I walked forward, but once I sat down and took the oath, something steadied inside me. I wasn't just telling my story anymore, I was confirming what the evidence already proved. I spoke about the night I found the lens, about resisting the urge to destroy it, about weeks of careful documentation. I explained the fear of finding the shoebox moved, the weight of carrying that secret while trying to live normally, the dismissal I faced at the police station, and the relief of finally being believed. My voice stayed steady because I wasn't speaking from memory alone. I was speaking from truth carved into every page of my notebook. Cross-examination was harsh. They tried to corner me, to twist my words, to make it seem like I had planted the device myself. I didn't take the bait. I repeated the same calm phrases. I discovered it. I documented it. I preserved it. That was all. When Diane took the stand again, her voice was stronger this time. She repeated what she had overheard and added that she had no reason to be involved other than wanting the truth known, but her presence was powerful in its simplicity. She wasn't fighting for herself. She was standing beside me because it was right. By the time the closing arguments began, the opposition sounded less confident. Their words lacked the polish they had carried in earlier hearings. My lawyer's closing was clear and direct. This wasn't a case built on speculation or paranoia. It was built on evidence, verified by experts, supported by testimony, and consistent from start to finish. The judge called for a recess before delivering the decision. Those minutes felt endless. I sat quietly with my lawyer and Diane, my hands resting on the notebook. Whatever happened, I knew I had done everything I could. When the judge returned, the room fell silent. He reviewed the case in measured words, acknowledging both sides, but his conclusion was firm. The evidence, he said, was undeniable. The presence of the camera in my private space was a violation that could not be excused or dismissed. The opposition's arguments had not discredited my claims. The ruling was in my favor. The sound of the gavel struck the air like a release. I exhaled for what felt like the first time in months. Around me, I could see the opposition slump, their control broken at last. Walking out of that courtroom, the sunlight felt sharper, clearer. The weight I had carried since that night under the lamplight was finally lifting. I knew the road ahead would still be difficult. There would be whispers, fallout, maybe even retaliation. But the core truth had been recognized. My privacy had been violated, and I had proven it. That evening, I sat alone in my living room. The shoebox was gone now, submitted as evidence, but the notebook rested on the table. I flipped through its pages slowly, tracing the journey from fear to fight. Each entry told the story of someone who refused to be silenced. For the first time in a long while, I felt at home in my own house again. Not because the world had changed, but because I had. If this story unsettled you, wait until you hear what happened when my nephew thought he could snoop through my phone without consequences. I didn't yell, I didn't argue. I printed every one of his messages and set them down at Christmas dinner. Watch that story next, you won't forget it.